In this example, I want to talk about nested loops. So loops can be nested just like you can nest if-else statements. Okay, we looked at those previously. So this is where one loop contains another loop, so within its body. You can see a quick example to the right here. For the most part in this lesson, we'll look at the for loop, but you can nest other loops as well, such as while loops and so on. We typically use the for loop with arrays, which is basically a data structure that contains multiple variables of the same type. You can also have 2D arrays, so two-dimensional arrays. We'll discuss those later in the module. It's important to remember that with each repetition of the outer loop, you can see here where the comments are, you can see the outer loop. That top for loop there is the outer loop. And then within its body, you can see we have another for loop. Now within the body, so that code block or compound statement that contains all of these statements that will execute with each repetition or iteration of that for loop. This can include other statements, so you can add switch statements, you can add loops or while loops, other nested loops inside of here as well, and so on. So the point is, with each repetition of the outer loop, all statements, including loops, that are in its body will execute. And then within that inner loop, you can see the comment says loops faster than the outer loop. And this simply refers to the fact that that inner loop will execute with each repetition of the outer loop until the outer for loop terminates. You can see in the console output, you'll get an idea of what this will print out. Now I have the backslash and the T there, and that is simply to add some tabs. So you can add spaces, but I've used this escape character here just to give us a single tab between the outputs. So before we move on, I'd like you to try and determine what the output will be for this program. So maybe in your notebook, on a piece of paper or something like that. So before we run it in Visual Studio. Okay, let's see what happens when I build and run this. I'll just move it over here so we can see more or less what's going on. So you can see while I is equal to 1, j will increment. The same thing with when I is 2, j will start with 1 again, increment till it's 3. And the same thing when I is 3. So we'll start with the outer loop. I is 1, 1 is less than or equal to 3. So it is less than 3. Then the body of that outer for loop will execute. We can have other statements in here. We can have, console output. We can have switch statements. We can have multiple loops, nested loops, and whatever else we want to do. In this case, we simply have this single nested for loop or inner loop. And that inner loop has a body of its own. And that simply prints this out right here. We are in this body now. So we enter this inner for loop. We declare and initialize j to 1. J is less than 3. So this body will execute. So we simply print this out. We print out I is, well, what is I in this case? I is still 1. Then j is what? J is currently 1. So we print that out. Then we go and increment j. We don't go up to the outer for loop. We are still within this inner for loop. So we increment j. J is now 2. 2 is still less than 3. So we print this out. I in this case is still 1. J is 2. So we print that out. And so on. Eventually this inner for loop will terminate. Then we'll go back up to the outer for loop. And what will happen then? Well, I is now 1, so I will increment, so that is now 2. Then we test, is I less than or equal to 3? That is true. Then we go and execute the statements that is within that, in this body of this outer for loop, which is this inner for loop. Okay. Then we go and declare and initialize j again. 1 is less than 3, so we execute the body of that inner for loop. We print this out. I is 2. You can see now we start over here. I is 2. It will print out j, which is 1, and so on. So you get the idea. This will eventually terminate again, this inner for loop. This outer for loop will again increment. The Boolean expression will evaluate, and so on, until that outer for loop will exit or will terminate. And then we'll exit the program. You can see exited with code 0. That's basically what we get. So with each repetition of the outer for loop, we will go and execute everything that is within its body, including other loops. Alright, so I hope that makes sense. Also pay attention to the indentation. So it makes it easy to read what's going on here. So again, always pay attention to your indentation. We can have as many levels of this as we need. So currently we just have one for loop nested within another for loop, but within this inner for loop, we can do another one. So instead of typing another for loop out within the body of this inner loop, I'm going to use a bit of a shortcut. I'm going to left click over here, press and hold shift, tap the up button, and then tap home. That will select those lines for me. You can also do it with the mouse, of course. Then I'll simply go and right click, and under snippet, click surround with. And we want another for loop, so I'll double click on that. I'll change this to k, so int k. You can see when I press tab to move over here, this in the Boolean expression will change to match whatever I change this initial one to. I'm not sure like how much this will actually speed up your workflow, but I do enjoy doing it this way. And I'll set it to 3 again, and I'll set it to less than or equal to, and I'll set k to 1 by default. Something like this. So with loops, as you'll see, we typically use variable names I, so int I, int j, int k, and so on, instead of x, y, z. Control F5 to run that. And you can see we get a lot of output here. In the first column, you can see 1 will be printed for I, so I will be 1 here 9 times. And then you can see for each iteration of that inner for loop, this one with the comment right here, when that is 1, the body of that loop will execute. You can see j is equal to 1, and then k will print out. So k1, k2, k3. This one with k here will break out. J will then be 2, so you can see I is still 1, j is 2, and then we start with k again, k1, 2, 3, and so on. So you can see we can get some really complex stuff when you nest loops like more than one level. Typically, I try and avoid nesting more than 2 loops. Okay, so we have 3 for loops here now. This is a bit much. Sometimes you have to do it, but in other cases, try and think of another way of maybe adding another loop later on in your program instead of having too many nested loops. Because if you build and run this with so many iterations, this will take some time to evaluate. For example, if we set this to, let's say 15, if I build and run this now, it's going to take some time to go and loop through all of those. You can see it's still running. So it takes some time to go and evaluate that. This will kind of block up your program. Okay, and other things will have to wait for this stuff to evaluate. So let's take a step back, and we just have the single for loop. So I'll build and run that, and you can see it displays 1, 2, 3. Now actually I'll remove this end line. Control F5 to run. You can see 1, 2, 3. I'll do an end line down here. Let's say I want this 1, 2, 3 to repeat multiple times. Because now, alright, because this is fairly easy to follow, we can see that with each repetition it's simply going to print out I. But let's say again I want to repeat this 1, 2, 3 multiple times. How can I do that? Well, what I'll do is I'll go and wrap that again in a for loop. Set that to 1, less than or equal to 3. I'll change that to j, and this inline I'll move up here in the body of this outer for loop. Again, with each repetition of this outer for loop, its body, all of the statements in its body will execute, including this console output and this inner for loop. So build and run that, we get the output. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, just like I wanted. So just another quick example. Another thing that is important to remember is that statements that are within the body of a for loop, all of those statements have access to the counter variable. So this outer for loop, for example, right, we have int I, and all of these statements, including this for loop, will have access to that I variable. Alright, so let's just do this. J is less than or equal to. I'll set that to I, and let's see what happens now. Control F5, you can see we get 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Again, maybe this makes it easier for you to kind of visualize how this works. The outer for loop will enter, we have int I is equal to 1, 1 is less than 3. We will enter the inner for loop, declare and initialize the variable j, set that to 1. 1 is equal to 1, so we will print 1. Then we will increment j, j is 2, 2 is not less than or equal to 1. So this inner for loop will terminate. We'll basically add a new line out to the console output stream, and then we'll go back and we'll increment I. So I is 2, 2 is less than 3, so we'll enter the body of that for loop again, and so on. You can see what's going on. We'll print j out again, j is 1, it'll increment to 2, 2 is equal to 2, it will print out 2, j will increment, it will be 3, 3 is not less than 2, so this inner for loop will terminate. Again, we get another space, and that will repeat, okay, and then that final output will be 1, 2, 3. So these are fairly simple examples that I try to use. Now, you have to experiment with this a bit, because it's going to be important once we get to arrays. So, but we will do more examples on this, as I mentioned later when we talk about arrays. But I do encourage you to go and play around and use other loops as well. Try it with for loops, try it with do while loops, do some input and output, and so on. Okay, so this is a quick look at nested loops. Hope you found this video useful, and I'll see you next time.